Okay, well, tonight what I want to talk about is moving forward in your life in spite of brokenness. And I want to put pressure, if I can, on the word choose. What I mean by that is if you walk away from this teaching with one thing, what I'd like you to walk away with is the word choose. I choose to, and then whatever it is that you choose to. And I think it's well known we have sin natures. I don't need to beat a dead horse in that we have a sin nature. Galatians chapter 5, verse 16 and 17. I walk by the Spirit, you will absolutely not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the flesh sets its desire against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. And these are opposed to each other, with the result that you're not doing what you want. Um, Every once in a while, I read a verse of scripture and think that's an understatement. The result that you're not doing what you want. Claire, I loved your prophecy, we're not called to live a life of fear and doubt and worry. And a lot of times what happens in people is the sin nature kind of sneaks up on them. Their faults, their failures, their mistakes. They feel guilty about mistakes in the past. They're concerned about the things they fail to do. They can't seem to keep their own promises, like I'm not going to eat another Oreo cookie for a month, or whatever it happens to be. I make promises like that. But, and what happens then is we can lose our energy. And what I want to share tonight is if we go to the text of Scripture, as we mature in Christ, we become more aware of our sin nature, not less aware of it. And what that can do is it can debilitate us and kind of rob us from strength. And what we need to get a hold of is that, okay, I've got a sin nature. Okay, I don't do what I want to do. Okay, I make mistakes. Okay, I've got a bad past, but I'm going to choose to do things for God now. And then we look at the wide open field in front of us because there's so many different ways we can help people. I mean, there are, if all you did was just look at the volunteer organizations in the United States, if that was the only thing you did, there would be huge opportunities to choose to serve. And I want to say the sin nature affects different people in different ways. And it's good to have people you can talk to about this. The devil wants to isolate and keep people from really sharing what's going on with them and having a really close friend or a couple really close friends that you can really share with, and then get some answers, get some release. It was the great psychologist Carl Rogers who said, that which is most personal is most universal. And that's true. So many times we sit down to share something with somebody and they go, oh my gosh, this is such a horrible thing. And I'm so ashamed of it. And I know if I share it, people are going to hate me. And then you share it with somebody and they're like, oh yeah, I go through that. It's like, what? And there's such freedom then in finding that kind of friendship. For some people, then the sin nature is just kind of an annoyance. They seem to make light of it. They just move on. For some people, the sin nature, the feelings of guilt and stuff are disorienting. They're debilitating. They're powerful feelings. And they need to be dealt with. And by the way, the sin nature can come with powerful feelings of guilt and shame. And I don't know if you've ever really thought deeply about the definition of shame, but a working definition of shame that is very, very good is that shame is the feeling that if people knew, they wouldn't want to be with me. You already feel bad about what you did. You feel somewhat isolated. And then if people knew about this, they wouldn't want to be with me. And that then just sets up prison bars that can really be debilitating to a person for a very long time. And then in the midst of this, people get stuck and they feel like, well, God can't work in me. God can't use me. I can't really, if people knew all I do was I would just besmirch the reputation of Christ. I can't get close to people, and people, we get stuck in stuff, and we need to break through that. And the feeling of being broken, for some people, it's depression, like I say, guilt, pain, shame, feeling of I can't do anything right. Why should I do anything for God? These things are really powerful. And the way we need to move through them is to recognize, number one, you're not going to get rid of them. The Apostle Paul couldn't get rid of his sin nature. And guess what? You can't either. We can deny it. We can try to renew our mind to it. We can do all kinds of mental gymnastics. But in the bottom line, in the end, you're going to end up where Paul ended up in Romans chapter 7. Oh, wretched man that I am. And so we don't want to waste our time trying to get rid of something we can't get rid of. What we want to do is focus on, God, what can I do for you? And we want to choose. So let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 30. And Deuteronomy chapter 30, and we've really got to get the context of this to understand the impact of this. We're going to start in what verse are we going to start in Deuteronomy chapter 30? We're going to start in verse 19. But before we go to Deuteronomy 30:19, let's set the stage. Deuteronomy is written it was written by Moses in the last 2 months of the 40 years of the wilderness wanderings. Deuteronomy was written in the 11th month, if you will, and then Moses died and they mourned for 30 days, which would be the last month of the wilderness wanderings, and then they crossed the Jordan. So they'd been in the wilderness for 39 years and 10 months. And how had they behaved? They were horrible. And by the way, Moses then, before he died, gave a prophecy over each tribe of Israel. You can read about that in the closing chapters of Deuteronomy. And did he have stellar things to say about them? Like, I know in the wilderness you were really horrible, but you're going to change and you're going to be great and God's going to be able to bless you. No, he said you're going to be idolaters and you're going to get smitten and all these horrible things are going to happen. So in the midst of this, we then have to read God's word to these people. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 19, he says, today, Moses speaking God's word, today I call heaven and earth to be witnesses against you. That's great. Thanks. I want the heavens and the earth to be, you go to a court. Who's my adversary in the court? Who's going to witness against me? Oh, only the heaven and the earth. It's like, well, the deck is kind of stacked here, isn't it? Holy smokes. He says, I call heaven and earth to be witnesses against you, that I've set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. But then he says this, therefore choose life. And he doesn't say, you can't, I set before you life and I'd like you to choose it, but you can't choose it as evil as you all are, as broken as you all are, as miserable and as full of shame as you guys are. You can't even choose life. No, he says, he knew all about them. He knew they were sinners. He knew they were broken. He knew they'd done all kinds of horrible things. He knew a whole bunch of them had idols because after Joshua, he's like, put away your idols. And yet, what did he still say? He said, choose life. And he puts before them the choice. And see, we have the same choice. We've all got problems. We've all got a past, a history. We've all got areas that we just can't seem to win, but we can choose life just like God told these people to choose life. And how did he do it? He said, how are you going to do this? Verse 20, by loving Yahweh your God, by obeying his voice, by holding fast to him, for he's your life and the length of your days, so that you may live in the land that Yahweh swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob to give them. So he says, I want you to choose life and do the word, do what you can. And a lot of times we fall short, but we choose life. We don't choose to be stuck. We choose to move on. Okay, Lord, clean slate. What can I do for you? I can help this person. I can go to this person's house and help them. Somebody had a death in their house. I can cook them some food and bring it to them. This guy's car is broken. I can help him with that. This place needs volunteers. I can help with that. There are people on my block that hadn't heard about Jesus. I can help with that. Instead of focusing on all of the misery inside ourselves, and there's plenty, and we can get stuck in it, but we can choose life. We can choose to do something. If we just take the Apostle Paul, when I talk about the inward journey of the Apostle Paul. Now, there's an interesting conflict here, because going on inside Paul, he talks about his inner man is renewed every day, and he's learning more and more about God. It's not till Ephesians, as he's getting close to the end of his ministry, that he's writing about the greatness of the sacred secret. So here's Paul, who's being renewed in the inward man, and in the knowledge man, he's gaining knowledge. But what he's also gaining is a sensitivity for others. How are others feeling? How are others doing? And how am I doing in relationship to all these things? And now that I really am learning more and more and more about the Lord, how am I doing in my obedience? And so he starts out in Corinthians. Now, Corinthians is about 55 AD. So we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 9. So here Paul is pretty well launched on his ministry. 55 is his first missionary itinerary was in the late 40s. He wrote Galatians in 48, went to the Jerusalem Council in 49. So this is about 6 years after that. The Apostle Paul is pretty much in touch with himself, we would think. 1 Corinthians 15:9, and Paul writes about himself, "For I am the least of the apostles, who am not fit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God." So if you said, okay, Paul, where do you stand on the say scale of humankind? You say, well, there's apostles out there. Well, I'm the worst one. But okay, but he's still an apostle. So then we let some time go by. We're going to let about 7 years go by, from 55 to 62, when he wrote Ephesians. So let's go to Ephesians chapter 3, verse 8. So he's now matured. He's learned a lot more about the sacred secret, in which Jews and Gentiles are one body, that kind of thing. And in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 8, he says, "To me, who am less than the least of all the believers," all the holy ones. He starts out, well, I'm the least of the apostles. Now he's matured in the faith, and he says, well, actually, I'm the least of the believers. And then we go forward another few years and we get to 1 Timothy. Let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 1. And in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 15, Paul is now writing in this. 1 Timothy is the last epistle he wrote when he was free. Then he traveled to Rome and was rearrested again. He wrote 2 Timothy from prison in Rome, and then would have been executed sometime before 68. But anyway, so here in verse 15 of 1 Timothy chapter 1, he says, "This statement is trustworthy and deserving of full acceptance. Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners." And then he adds, "Oh, and I'm the worst." So what's intriguing is, as Paul matures in the faith, his awareness of his sin nature and his shortcomings and his failures becomes greater and greater. He goes from the least of the apostles to the least of the believers, to the worst of sinners. And you're thinking, is that real growth? And the answer is sure it is. Because if you look at what he did, what he accomplished, it didn't keep him from choosing. He chose to do so much for so many. Even and when he was chained to a soldier in Acts 28, and it says he received everybody that came to him, and he managed to write three prison epistles, and he wrote Philemon. I mean, so he did a lot in spite of his awareness of his shortcomings, because he chose to. And that's what you and I need to do. Yes, you may be depressed. Yes, you may be ashamed of what's happened in your life. Yes, you may be feeling like you can't get anything done right. But if you keep choosing to do the next thing for God, might be pray, might be read your Bible, might be talk to your neighbor, might be, God, who can I call today on the phone? I'm not feeling very good today, can't get out and really be energetic outside, but I can call people on the phone. Who can I call? Just let God feed you information. Get into the fight. A lot of times, just like Paul, when we become closer and closer to God, we become more and more aware of who we aren't. that we're not, believer man, Superman. And I get a kick if you read through the Bible about the great men and women who encountered God. Their reactions to encountering God is just amazing. Let's start in Exodus chapter 3 with Moses. So here, and what I love about this is that I'm not going to read the record because we got other things to do tonight. But what I want to show is this is in Moses. This is God Himself talking to Moses out of a bush. God's actually talking to an angel, but since the angel was speaking in first person to Moses, it was God. So you'd think if God said, Moses, I've chosen you. Wow, God, thanks. That's great. I love it. What a privilege. No, God says, I've chosen you and I've come down and that kind of thing. And verse 11, but Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? God's just talking to him, telling him that I'm sending you. Now, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? He's got this, he's been herding sheep for 40 years and that kind of thing. He's got some stuff to overcome in his life. Who am I? Then if we go to the next chapter, I love what he says here in verse 13. God's talking to him, trying to get him to go. And finally, he says in verse 13, pardon, oh my Lord, please send someone else. And that's, this is Moses. Then God gets mad at him and he says, okay, I'll go already. And you find out that in spite of his shortcomings, he goes, and look at all the great things he does. Let's go to Jeremiah chapter 1. And some of these guys are just great. Jeremiah chapter 1, we'll start right in verse 1. The words of Jeremiah, the son of Hakaliah, Hilkiah, one of the priests who was in Anatoth in the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of Yahweh came in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. So we know exactly when Jeremiah started. It was in the 13th year of the reign of Ammon of Judah. And then it says it also came in the days of Jehoiakim, verse 4. Now the word of Yahweh came to me saying, and so this is God's voice to Jeremiah. Verse 5, Jeremiah is a young man. Before I formed you in the belly, I knew you. Before you came out of the womb, I set you apart. And you can hear Jeremiah hearing this voice. Before you were born, I knew you. And he's like, yeah, that's pretty cool. And God says, before you came out of the womb, I set you apart. I've appointed you as a prophet to the nations. And so Jeremiah says, wow, that's really cool. I'd love to be a prophet. No, he says, oh, Lord Yahweh, behold, I don't know how to speak. Wait a minute. Moses has said that in Exodus 4. Behold, I don't know how to speak. I'm a youth. So now what's he saying? Bottom line, he's saying the same thing Moses. Send somebody else. You picked the wrong guy. And Yahweh says, I like this. Yahweh says, do not say I am a youth. For to whomever I will send you, you will go. And so God had to wrestle with Jeremiah a bit. But then in spite of this and the way he felt about himself, look at the greatness of what he accomplished in his life and the boldness that he had. It's amazing. Let's go to Ezekiel. What I want to show you here is this pattern that the great men of the Bible, when they were called, didn't jump up and down and say, yay, you finally noticed me. Universally, they kind of said, I'm not qualified for this, God. Well, have you ever felt that? God, if you knew about my past, if you knew about this, if you knew about that, if you knew about my failures, I'm not qualified. What's God saying? What's Paul write in Corinthians? He says, God has made us sufficient because our sufficiency is of God. We are sufficient. We've just got to choose to believe we are and choose to do something. So here's Ezekiel. And I just love the opening chapter of Ezekiel, but I can't take the time right now to teach it, but it's just fabulous. But anyway, in Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 28, now we have God appears to Ezekiel. And the last phrase shows you what Ezekiel's reaction to this is. It says, I fell on my face. That's what I did. God showed up and I went, pow, right down on my face. And he says, and I heard the voice of someone speaking. So we go to the next chapter, chapter 2, first verse 1. And I like this. He said to me, son of man, stand on your feet and I will speak with you. So we're back in Ezekiel, and remember now, Ezekiel's on his face, and God says, son of man, stand on your feet and I will speak to you. Well, I don't know what was going on, but apparently Ezekiel wasn't in a hurry to get up. And so verse 2, when he spoke to me, the Spirit entered me and set me on my feet. God's like, you will get up. He takes, and he stands him up. And then he says to me, son of man, I'm sending you to the children of Israel. And he goes through this. And so he tells Ezekiel how difficult it's going to be. So then by chapter 3, he says, he speaks these words. And what happens is, verse 15, then I came to them of the captivity at Tel Aviv that lived by the Shabar Canal, and to where they live, and I sat there overwhelmed. God said, go there and speak. So he goes and he can't speak because he's overwhelmed. And then finally, verse 16, it came to pass at the end of 7 days, and you can see for a whole week, God's up in heaven twiddling his thumbs. It's like, when is my prophet going to get up and speak? For Pete's sake, he's right there. He's in front of the people. And then, so it came to pass at the end of 7 days that the word of Yahweh came to me saying, son of man, I've made you a watchman to the house of Israel. Therefore, hear the word from my mouth and give them warning from me. And then finally, Ezekiel had the courage or the wherewithal to go and speak. And then, of course, we read Ezekiel and he became an amazingly powerful and effective prophet. But he didn't start that way. You've got to choose. You're going to overcome your feelings of shortcomings or your feelings of guilt or your feelings of whatever's holding you back. And you can move forward for God in spite of those. They don't have to go away. That's the great message. You can still feel, you may still feel guilty. You probably will feel guilty. You may still feel shame. These things don't just go away. But in spite of those things, we can move forward. Let's go see one more. Let's go to Isaiah. And Isaiah, I love Isaiah chapter 6. They got that song after it, the Lord high and lifted up. And here it is in verse 1, the year that King Uzziah died, Isaiah 6:1. I saw the Lord sitting on a throne high and lifted up. The edges of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face. With 2 he covered his feet. With 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, holy, holy, holy is Yahweh of armies. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook. That's the temple in heaven. The foundation of the thresholds of the temple in heaven shook at the voice of him who called. And the house, that's the temple, was filled with smoke. All through the Bible, the temple is called the house. We see that in Acts chapter 2 with the sound of the wind that filled the house, the temple, where everybody was. And Ezekiel was like, wow, I just saw God. This is so cool. No. Verse 5, he says, woe is me, I am ruined. You'd think, if God showed up, you'd be so excited. Instead, he's like, oh, it's God. Whoa, I'm ruined. And then he said, I'm a man of unclean lips. He probably was, but God called him anyway. I'm a man of unclean lips. What did Peter say? The Lord, after the catch of fish, when the Lord called Peter, Peter said, "Go away from me, Lord, I'm a sinner." Well, that didn't stop Jesus. He didn't say, "You're right, you're a sinner, I'm leaving." When the Lord wants all of us in our sinful state. Isaiah says, "I'm a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips. And my eyes have seen the King, Yahweh of armies." And God called him anyway. And you look at Isaiah, 66 books of just pure prophetic gold. Amazing what he does in his life. So let's go to Romans chapter 7. Romans chapter 7 is just such a powerful thesis, if you will, about the sin nature and about what happens in the interaction between the sin nature and us. Because what happened to Paul is it was a personal journey for Paul, but it's actually a personal journey for all of us. Everybody's familiar with the verses in here that says, I don't do what I want to do and that kind of thing. That's not where I want to start. I want to start in verse 7. And because if we get the whole picture of what's going on here, it's just so powerful. Now, people were saying that the law was sinful because the law showed up and then it was like, oh my gosh, I'm caught up in all this sin. So Paul's going to answer that. And he says in verse 7 of Romans 7, "What then are we to say? Is the law sin?" That's on the table. The law makes everybody feel guilty. Is the law sin? And Paul says, absolutely not. On the contrary, I would not have come to know sin if it were not for the law. And so there's going to be an interesting twist here, but he says, wow, I wouldn't have even known what sin was if it wasn't for the law. The law is not sinful. The law is helpful. It guides us. It lets me know what sin is. Look at how cool it is to know this is sinful and this is not. La, 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 la. It's almost a carefree verse. I wouldn't have known about sin if it weren't for the law, because I wouldn't have known what it is to covet if the law had said, do not covet. So he's going, okay, so the law is this really great thing. But then what happens? Verse 8, but sin, and he personifies sin here. And I think that somebody could do like a skit, because you'd have this person and he's being so carefree, and then there'd come in a kind of a Darth Vader figure, this guy in a black cape, and he kind of sneaks in, because that's what happened. You're going, la, 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 now I know what sin is and I can avoid it. And what happens? Sin. It sneaks in. It seizes an opportunity afforded by the commandment, produced in me all kinds of coveting. Wow, I was coveting and I didn't know it. So I didn't know about sin. And all of a sudden I know what coveting is. And now it's kind of all over me. And then he makes an interesting statement. He says, apart from a law, sin is dead. Oh, well, now what would I rather have? Would I rather not have a law and nothing is sinful? Or would I rather have a law? And then sin sneaks in and gets me. And so he says here, apart from a law, sin is dead. Verse 9, and I was alive apart from law once. What's Paul saying? Well, there was a time when it didn't bother me that I wasn't keeping the law. Now, this is not talking about his childhood, but it's talking about the state that people live in before they really come to grips with a desire to serve God. Because if you think about it for a second, think of the unbelievers that you know. If they don't have a desire to please God, if they don't have an awareness that they should obey God, it doesn't bother them at all that they don't pray, that they don't read their Bible, that they don't go to church or fellowship, that they don't try to help others, that they don't become self-sacrificing, et cetera, et cetera. Doesn't bother them at all. They're totally carefree. And so they're alive, they're carefree, they're joyful, they're having a great time. And that's what he's saying here. When he's using the word alive here, like we talk about, the party was just alive. And that's the way he's using it here. I was alive apart from the law once, but when the commandment came, sin came alive and I died. So now we have an interesting irony going on in verse 8 and 9, because if you don't have a law, sin is dead. But when you bring the law in, you die and the sin comes alive. And that's what he said. Gosh, sin was dead. And then the law came, and then I was dead, and sin was alive. And that's basically what it's saying. As he's going to develop that in verse 10, and I discovered. And how did he discover it? He discovered it by living in it. When the law first comes in, like, verse 7, I wouldn't have come to know sin if it weren't for the law. The first time the law comes in, it's like, oh, this is so wonderful. Oh, this is so helpful. Now I know what sin is. La, 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 la. But all of a sudden, verse 10, then you discover, and I discover lots of things through my life. I've made all kinds of commitments that I haven't kept. I've screwed up in myriads of different ways. And you discover that the commandment actually seems to work against you, because before there was a commandment, it didn't bother you that you didn't do whatever it was. And all of a sudden, here comes the commandment. And this is what we have to be careful of. The commandment can produce a heaviness that this chapter compares to death, where you're just so beaten down by your own sin that you just don't feel like doing anything. I don't, like earlier in the year, one of my New Year's resolutions in January, I went into it with such steam and so much verve. I was going to read a psalm a day for the first 150 days of the year. Yeah, that lasted till Psalm 16. I still have it in my notes. Psalm 16. It's the psalm I quit at. It's like, it's one more thing. So what do? Do I condemn myself and say, I'm not reading the Bible again because I can't keep my commitment? No, of course not. You push on and you choose to make the next best step. So when Paul says, I discovered, he actually did. As he woke up spiritually to the things God wanted him to do, he discovered he couldn't do them. And that's going to come up later in Romans 7, something you're very familiar with. But it's that discovery that can be so painful. As we make commitments and break them, as we fall short, as we say things we shouldn't say. Genevieve and I were in a conversation with a couple not too long ago, and I made a statement that at the time I thought was really harmless. But then it was like, thinking back on it, was like, oh, I shouldn't have said that. And then you go through all the, oh my gosh, here I go again, saying the wrong thing, blah, 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 blah. And that kind of thing, it's heavy. I'm trying to make this teaching a little light and funny, but the fact of the matter is it's heavy stuff, because people get caught up in the guilt, they get caught up in the shame. They become afraid of failing again, and so then they don't move forward. And what God is saying to us is the same thing he said to the children of Israel, who were huge sinners, and he said, choose life. God's asking us to do the same thing. Choose to move forward. Choose to do the next best thing. Choose to do the next right thing. God is more than happy to deal with us in our sinful state, and just allow us to just simply move forward. So Paul here in verse 10, I discovered that the commandment that was given for life actually resulted in death. And that's that heaviness. It's not that it resulted in Paul's dying. By the time he'd written Romans, he already wrote, Romans chapter 6, for example, that, you can't, your salvation is permanent. He's not worried about dying here, dying in the sense of everlasting death, but it's just, man, failing over and over again. It just kills your energy, kills your dreams, kills your enthusiasm. And so we've got to fight that with all the strength that we have. In verse 11, for it was sin that finding an opportunity through the commandment completely deceived me. How did sin deceive me? Because it said, oh, the commandment's going to be great. Well, it wasn't so great. It did guide us when we could keep it, but then we screwed up so much. It deceived me. And through the commandment, sin killed me, the sin in me. And this is, again, this is talking about the sin nature. It's this sin in me that keeps popping up and outworking, and it kills me. But how does it do it? It kills me through the commandment. You got to be kidding me. He uses the commandment, verse 12. So then the law is holy and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. Verse 13, did what is good then become a cause of death for me? Absolutely not. It wasn't the law that killed me. It was my sin nature and my failure to keep it. On the contrary, it was the sin that killed me, with the result that it was shown to be sin by using that which is good to produce my death. And that's what sin does. Sin takes something that's good, in this case, the law of God, or your good intentions, or your commitments to do something good, or the things that are good, and sin uses those against you. And that's, again, we just have to work through that, push through that, recognize what's going on. And I'm not going to let you do this to me, sin. I'm not going to let you do this to me. With the result that through the commandments, sin became utterly sinful, and we knew it was really sinful. And verse 14, for we know that the law is spiritual, but I'm flesh, having been sold as a slave to sin. Who did that? Adam. Adam sinned and got sin nature and then passed it down to all of his descendants. So who sold us? Adam did. I was sold as a slave to sin. For I do not understand my own actions. For I'm not practicing what I want. I'm doing the very thing I hate. And if I do that which I do not want, I agree with the law that it's good. So now it's no longer I who acts this way, but sin living in me. And that's the sin nature. The sin nature jumps all over us, beats us up, and that kind of thing. Verse 18, for I know that nothing good lives in me, that is in my flesh. For desire to do good is present with me, but acting out that good is not, again, because of the weakness of the flesh and the sin nature. Verse 19, for I do not do the good that I want, but what I do not want, that evil I practice. Now, if I do what I do not want, it's no longer I who acts this way, but sin that lives in me. And that's a great realization. It's not me, the inner me, the Christ in me, the way I feel that acts this way. It's the sin nature that Galatians chapter 5 says fights against my spirit nature, so I can't do the things I want. And if we recognize that, we can kind of get off our own case a little bit. And even when we're having problems, we can still say, you know what, I've got problems, but I can choose to do something for God, just like Deuteronomy says. Choose life, make a choice, find something to do for God and do it. And then he says, verse 21, so I discover a law that while I'm wanting to do good, evil is present with me. And that's there's the inner me and there's the sin nature in me. Verse 22, for I delight in the law of God, so far as my inner self is concerned. Your inner self is the you that's the real you. It's the you that when you talk to yourself, that's who it is. When I give myself a lecture, that's who it is. That's the inner self. Verse 23, but I see a different law in the members of my body, waging a war against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin that's in my members, because my body of flesh is weak and full of failure. And then I've got a sin nature that is wrapped up in there too. So there's the war, same war that Galatians chapter 5, 16, 17 is talking about. So we get down to the conclusion, wretched man that I am. Yeah. Well, here's the Apostle Paul. How's he feel about himself? Wretched man that I am. You take a look at what Paul accomplished in his life. Notice that he didn't say in Romans, wretched man that I am. I'm confident God doesn't want to work with me anymore. This is the last line I'm ever going to write. He said, wretched man that I am. And he recognized that, but it didn't keep him doing phenomenal, amazing, great things for God. And that's got to be us. We've got to choose to move forward in our pain, choose to move forward in our shame, choose to move forward in our feelings of shortcoming, choose to move forward when we're not really clear on what is the thing that God really wants me to do. That's pretty ethereal. Every once in a while, like the prophets, God will speak to Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and say, I want you to do this. Pretty dang rare. Usually God says, look at all the cool things you can do. Choose one. And then it's our responsibility to go out and find something to do. So he goes on, wretched man that I am, who will rescue me out of this body of death? And that's exactly right. It's a body that produces death in us, the death of our dreams, the death of our energy, the death of our feeling that we're worth something. Who's going to deliver me for this body that's got a sin nature, that's producing these thoughts that are killing so much of me? And then, of course, the answer, verse 25, thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then with my mind, I myself am serving as a slave to the law of God, thank God. But with my flesh, well, it serves the law of sin. They're at war. I've got to move on. I've got to do what Deuteronomy says. I've got to choose life. So you and I have a choice. We can get all caught up in our sin and our failure and our shortcomings and our shame and say that God wouldn't want to work with us and there's not much we can do. Or we can choose to find something to do for God in spite of the wretched human beings that we are, using biblical language, because truly in our flesh, just like the Apostle Paul, we can be pretty wretched. But like the Apostle Paul, we can do great things in spite of any fleshly wretchedness. Guys, it's been a privilege to teach with you with this tonight. I had so much fun working through Romans 7 verse by verse today and rounding up this other stuff. And I really appreciate your being here. So thank you so much. And the floor is open for sharing or wherever we want to go.